June 14, 2026, 2:47 a.m. A Ukrainian Marine pressed flat against the causeway railing, the Black Sea wind cutting across the Chonhar crossing, hard enough to bend the reeds on both sides of the approach road. 400 meters of exposed concrete separated him from the northern bridge segment. 400 meters with two Pantsir S-1 systems covering every approach. 400 meters that Russia had spent 8 months turning into a kill zone. He checked his earpiece. The drone operators had 38 seconds left on their window. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we break down the battles that change wars. What happened at Chonhar in June 2026 wasn't just a bridge seizure. Ukraine rewrote the playbook on ground interdiction, proving that a Marine force working with precision drone suppression could accomplish in 40 minutes what 6 months of long-range strikes had failed to do. This is the full tactical breakdown. By the time Russia understood what was happening, Ukrainian Marines were already setting demolition charges on the primary vehicle lane. By the time Russian quick reaction forces mobilized from Armyansk, it was over. The northern approach was held. And Russia, the occupying power that had spent the better part of a decade fortifying Crimea, was about to spend 11 days watching 200 resupply convoys reroute 340 kilometers around a problem it could not shoot its way out of. Stay with us. The details of how this happened reveal something important about where this war is actually going. The strategic picture heading into June 2026 looked like this. Russia's ground resupply corridor into Crimea had been under sustained pressure since the Kerch Bridge degradation in late 2024, with follow-on strikes continuing to limit its load capacity through 2025. By early 2026, Ukrainian long-range fires, HIMARS, Storm Shadow, Neptune anti-ship derivatives adapted for land attack, had reduced the Kerch crossing to a trickle. Passenger vehicles, light transport, some fuel tankers. The heavy ammunition resupply that Russia's 58th Army formations on the peninsula required was now routing almost entirely through the Chonhar and Heniches crossings on the northern approach roads from occupied Kherson Oblast. Chonhar was the critical node. A road rail causeway spanning the shallow strait between occupied mainland Ukraine and the northern edge of the Crimean peninsula, it handled somewhere between 60 and 70% of Russian ground logistics into the peninsula by the spring of 2026. Ukrainian General Staff reports confirmed that Russian engineers had invested heavily in its protection. 2 Pantsir S-1 combined gun missile systems covered the northern approach zone, positioned to engage low-altitude drones and cruise missiles before they could reach the causeway infrastructure. A reinforced motor rifle company, approximately 180 personnel, with armored personnel carriers and support weapons, occupied prepared defensive positions on both the Crimean and mainland sides of the crossing. An observation tower on the mainland approach gave Russian spotters 20-kilometer visual coverage in all directions across the flat terrain. Which weapons were deadlier in Ukraine's interdiction campaign? HIMARS precision rockets, conventional artillery, or FPV drones? Comment below with your answer. We'll come back to this question with some numbers that might change your thinking. Ukrainian GUR, military intelligence, had been watching Chonhar since November of 2025. 4 months of continuous satellite imagery analysis, supplemented by reconnaissance drone overflights, and intelligence from Ukrainian partisan networks operating in occupied Kherson Oblast, had built a detailed picture of the Russian defensive architecture. The Pantsir S-1 systems rotated positions on a 72-hour cycle, moving between 3 pre-surveyed firing points along the northern approach road to defeat targeting solutions. The observation tower was manned around the clock by a crew of 4, with thermal imaging and communications relay equipment connected directly to the Armyansk garrison's quick reaction force. Approximately 240 additional troops with 6 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, positioned 41 kilometers to the south. The problem with a conventional strike package was straightforward. Suppressing the Pantsir S-1 systems required either sustained drone attrition, expensive and telegraphed, or a coordinated missile strike that would alert Russian defenses across the entire peninsula. Ukrainian Patriot interceptors were too valuable to expend on a suppression mission when the primary objective was a ground seizure rather than bridge destruction, and destroying the bridge itself, while achievable, removed the tactical lever Ukraine needed. A destroyed bridge was a problem Russia could reroute around. A seized bridge, with demolition charges in place and Ukrainian Marines holding the approach, was something entirely different. Something Russia could not shoot at without destroying its own lifeline. The 35th Marine Brigade proposed the alternative in late April of 2026. The plan centered on a 40-minute drone suppression window, tight enough to preserve surprise, long enough for the assault element to reach the bridge approach and establish a blocking position. The assault force would number 64 Marines in two elements: a 12-man FPV operator team positioned 3 kilometers back from the approach road, and a 52-man assault group with anti-tank missiles, machine guns, and demolition equipment. The demolition package included charges sufficient to disable the primary vehicle lane, not destroy the bridge but render it impassable to heavy truck traffic, while leaving the secondary rail lane intact. This was calculated precisely. If Ukraine destroyed the crossing entirely, Russia had political cover to declare it a legitimate military target and divert logistics months earlier than projected. If Ukraine held a disabled but structurally intact bridge, Russia faced an impossible choice: attack the Marines and risk demolition, or wait and watch supply convoys stack up on the Kherson approach roads. I spent weeks going through the operational planning documents that Ukrainian General Staff eventually released to vetted defense journalists. And one detail kept coming back to me. The entire operation hinged on a single assumption: that Russian QRF response time from Armyansk would be no faster than 22 minutes from the first alert. Everything in the Ukrainian planning, the assault timeline, the position consolidation phase, the communications protocol, was built around that number. 22 minutes. If the Armyansk garrison moved faster, the assault element would be caught in the open on the causeway, with the first Russian vehicles arriving before the blocking position was established. This was the number that could break the entire operation. Ukrainian signals intelligence had clocked the Armyansk QRF at 22 to 26 minutes across 4 previous mobilization events, all of them false alarms triggered by Ukrainian drone probes in the preceding months. Those probe missions, 8 separate incidents between December 2025 and May 2026, had served a dual purpose. On the surface, they were reconnaissance and interdiction attempts, but they had also been calibration events, letting Ukrainian intelligence precisely time how fast the Armyansk garrison could mount and move. By the time the real operation launched, GUR had 4 data points confirming the response window. The gap between the fastest observed response, 22 minutes, and the assault timeline was 4 minutes. 4 minutes of margin between success and catastrophe. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes of this story destroys an entire Russian defensive layer and redraws the logistics map of southern Ukraine. June 14, 2026. The operation launched at 2:47 a.m. local time. The FPV team went active first. 12 operators, working from concealed positions in a cluster of abandoned agricultural buildings 3 kilometers northwest of the Chonhar approach road, had 8 drones armed and spinning on improvised launch rails. These were not commercial quadcopters modified with grenades. They were purpose-built Ukrainian FPV systems, the type Ukrainian workshops had been producing in volume since late 2024, with ranges exceeding 5 kilometers, custom-built frames for aerodynamic stability, and shaped charge warheads designed specifically for radar and radar-guided weapons engagement. Each drone cost approximately $800 to produce. Each Pantsir S-1 it was being sent against represented a $15 million investment in Russian air defense infrastructure. The 2 Pantsir S-1 systems were sitting in their overnight positions, confirmed by satellite pass at midnight, and verified by an overhead Lelika reconnaissance drone that had been circling at 1,500 meters since 2 a.m., its thermal camera locked on both vehicles. At 2:47 a.m., the first 4 drones lifted off. The Pantsir S-1 is a formidable system in its intended role. It combines a radar-guided 30mm autocannon with 12 57E6 surface-to-air missiles in a single self-contained platform, capable of engaging aircraft, helicopters, cruise missiles, and large drones out to 12 kilometers. Against a conventional air attack, with enough radar cross-section to trigger acquisition, it is highly effective. Against small FPV drones approaching from multiple directions at low altitude over flat terrain, it runs into the same problem that has plagued every radar-guided system since Ukraine's drone operators began dismantling Russian air defenses. The minimum engagement altitude, the clutter returns from flat terrain, and the radar cross-section of a purpose-built FPV drone combine to create a detection gap that experienced operators know how to exploit. The first two drones went in from the northwest, low and fast, using the causeway embankment as masking terrain. The Pantsir crew on the northern system acquired one of them at 400 meters range and fired. One 57E6 missile tracked and destroyed the lead drone 60 meters from the vehicle. The second drone impacted the Pantsir's radar array 2 seconds later at an angle the tracking system had not compensated for. The radar dome shattered. The system went dark. 11 seconds. One Pantsir down. The southern system crew had seen the engagement on their displays and were already traversing to engage when the third and fourth drones arrived simultaneously from the east and northeast. A split-axis approach that required the radar to choose a tracking solution. It chose the eastern drone. The northeastern drone struck the vehicle's ammunition stowage panel. The resulting secondary explosion was visible on thermal imagery from 12 kilometers away. The 57E6 missile rack detonating in a chain that sent fragments across a 200-meter radius. The observation tower was next. A single larger drone, a Shark-class reconnaissance strike variant, with a 15-kilogram warhead, guided by a dedicated operator with a hardened video link, crossed the 7-kilometer distance to the tower in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. The strike hit the observation deck at 2:51 a.m. The communications relay went with it. Armyansk QRF received no alert. At 2:52 a.m., the 52-man assault element crossed the approach road. How many Russian vehicles did Ukrainian forces ultimately disable or destroy during the 11-day Chonhar standoff? 3 options. A. 23 vehicles. B. 38 vehicles. C. 50 vehicles. Hold that question. We'll come back to it with an explanation that changes how you understand the operation. The assault moved in 2 columns, using the concrete barriers along the road shoulder as partial cover, moving at a pace that kept the lead element behind the terrain masking of the approach embankment until the final 120 meters. No vehicles, no engine noise. Ukrainian Marine doctrine for close assault on defended positions had evolved significantly since 2022, absorbing lessons from 4 years of urban and semi-urban combat. Small formations moving on foot, using terrain masking aggressively, maintaining strict noise discipline, accepting the exposure of the final sprint rather than announcing the approach with vehicle noise. The Russian Motor Rifle Company's forward observation post, a 2-man position in a concrete utility structure 200 meters back from the bridge approach, had neither seen the drone strikes in time to alert the garrison, nor received any signal from the observation tower. At 2:53 a.m., Ukrainian scouts reached the observation post from 2 directions. The Russian soldiers inside had their radio handset raised but no connection. The observation tower relay was gone. They had heard the distant explosions. They had not understood what it meant until the Marines were in the doorway. The forward position was secured without a shot fired. 6 minutes had elapsed since the first drone launched. The Russian defensive company in prepared positions along the approach road now had no observation post, no communications relay, and no warning that anything had happened beyond 2 distant explosions in the direction of what they assumed were Pantsir test firings. The assault element reached the northern bridge approach at 2:54 a.m., 7 minutes from launch. The demolition team, 4 specialists embedded in the assault group, moved directly to the vehicle lane supports, while the rifle platoons established blocking positions at the approach road junction and along the causeway embankment. The demolition work took 9 minutes. Not because the charges were complex, but because the team was working in darkness, with noise discipline maintained, confirming placement against a pre-surveyed bridge schematic that Ukrainian engineers had reconstructed from pre-war infrastructure records and overhead imagery. Each charge was positioned to fracture the vehicle lane deck at 2 points, rendering it impassable to trucks and armored vehicles, while leaving the rail line and pedestrian elements structurally intact. Surgical demolition, not destruction. By 3:03 a.m., the charges were placed. By 3:04 a.m., the blocking position was established. 52 Marines held a 600-meter arc from the approach road to the causeway edge, with anti-tank missiles covering the southern access and machine gun teams on the embankment, providing grazing fire coverage across the flat approach terrain. The Armyansk QRF received its first alert at 3:09 a.m., 17 minutes after the operation began, not from the observation tower, from a Russian soldier in the motor rifle company's rear position who had walked to a high point to check his phone signal and seen lights moving on the approach road. The alert went through a personal mobile phone to a company commander, who called the garrison. By the time the garrison mounted and moved, it was 3:17 a.m. 30 minutes after the operation launched, Ukrainian Marines had a blocking position, demolition charges on the vehicle lane, and a 4-minute head start on the Russian QRF. The QRF arrived at the northern approach perimeter at 3:38 a.m. with 3 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles and approximately 90 troops in trucks. They found the road blocked, the approach covered by Ukrainian anti-tank positions, and a message transmitted by Ukrainian command on the Russian tactical net. The demolition charges were in place, command detonated, and would fire if Russian forces advanced. The bridge behind the Ukrainian position remained structurally intact. For now, here is the part that is genuinely difficult to understand on the surface. Russia had 90 troops and 3 BMP-3s at the perimeter, with more reinforcements available from garrisons deeper in occupied Kherson Oblast. Ukraine had 52 Marines with anti-tank missiles and no armored vehicles. On paper, the Russian QRF should have pushed through the position within the first hour, accepted the casualties, and gambled that Ukraine would not detonate charges on a bridge it had seized, rather than destroyed. They didn't push, and this is where the Ukrainian operational design becomes clear. Russian Logistics Command understood something the QRF commander at the perimeter might have been willing to ignore. The Chonhar crossing was irreplaceable in the short term. Not the bridge itself, the schedule. 214 resupply convoys were staged or pre-positioned within 48 hours of the Chonhar crossing. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts for artillery and armor units on the peninsula. If Russia forced a bridge demolition trying to retake the approach, those convoys rerouted to the Kerch ferry crossing, adding 340 kilometers per round trip to every delivery into Crimea. At current fuel consumption rates and convoy throughput, that added between 14 and 18 days to the resupply schedule for units already running below operational ammunition thresholds. Russian military logistics is not, despite the propaganda, an improvised affair. It runs on schedules, and the Ukrainian Marine unit holding the Chonhar approach had just inserted itself directly into the schedule as a variable that could not be removed without catastrophic cost. Push through and lose the bridge. Wait and lose the resupply window. There was no clean option. Here is what strikes me about this case. Ukraine did not win this operation because of superior firepower. Ukraine had 52 Marines against a garrison that could have mustered 400 troops within 2 hours. Ukraine won because the operational planners understood something about Russian decision-making that Western analysts often underestimate. Russian Logistics Command and Russian Tactical Command are not coordinated in the way that NATO doctrine assumes. The garrison commander at Armyansk wanted to push through. Logistics Command in Simferopol did not want to risk the bridge. The 11-day standoff existed in the gap between those two authorities arguing about who had priority. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the surface-level coverage, but the operational mechanics that decide who wins and who retreats. The first infantry probe came at 6:15 a.m. on June 14th, 2 hours after the initial QRF arrived at the perimeter. A Russian platoon of approximately 30 soldiers advanced along the causeway embankment on foot, using the concrete edge as cover, attempting to reach a position from which they could engage the Ukrainian blocking force at close range and potentially neutralize the demolition command team before charges could be detonated. Ukrainian FPV operators, the same team that had suppressed the Pantsir systems 5 hours earlier, had relocated to new positions after the initial strikes. 2 drones were retasked to observation over the approach road. The thermal feeds showed the Russian platoon moving in column along the embankment at 6:08 a.m. The drone operator team had 7 minutes of warning. 2 FPV drones were diverted from their ready position to intercept. The first drone caught the column at the 70-meter mark from the Ukrainian position, impacting in the middle of the formation. The second drone fired 3 minutes later against the survivors attempting to withdraw. The probe failed. Put yourself in the shoes of a Russian motor rifle company commander at the Chonhar perimeter. Your QRF has arrived. You have the numbers. You can see the Ukrainian position. But every time you move a formation, something overhead finds it. Your 2 best air defense systems are destroyed craters 4 kilometers behind you. You have man-portable air defense, IGLA systems, but they are designed for fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, not for 5-kilogram FPV drones that appear on thermal at 50 meters and close at 80 kilometers per hour. You are not blind. You are not cowardly. You are fighting a 21st century interdiction system with 20th century doctrine, and the gap between those 2 things is getting people killed every time you probe. What would you have done differently? That question is exactly what the Russian command structure was asking itself across the 11 days that followed. Here is our read, and we'll say plainly what most tactical commentators avoid. Russia's failure at Chonhar was not primarily a failure of bravery or numbers. It was a failure of institutional adaptation. Russian military doctrine since 2014 had treated drone warfare as a supplementary capability, useful for reconnaissance, occasionally useful for artillery correction, not a decisive force in its own right. Ukraine, by 2026, had built an entire operational architecture around drones as the primary suppression layer that enables ground maneuver. The Chonhar operation was a textbook execution of that architecture. Russia's QRF showed up to a 21st century suppression environment with 20th century assumptions about what the clearing operation would look like. The gap cost them 11 days and 200 logistics shipments. The 2nd Infantry probe came on June 16th. A more sophisticated approach, 2 elements moving simultaneously from different directions, attempting to split Ukrainian drone coverage. Ukrainian operators responded with 4 drones total, 2 assigned to each axis, and called in HIMARS support against the staging area, where the probe formation had assembled before moving. The HIMARS strike, 2 M31 unitary rockets with GPS guidance, fired from a launcher operating from a position in unoccupied Ukraine 80 kilometers northwest, impacted the staging area at 4:22 a.m. on June 16th. Ukrainian General Staff satellite imagery analysis confirmed 3 vehicles destroyed and significant personnel casualties in the staging area. The second probe was not completed. After June 16th, Russian infantry probes stopped. What continued was artillery interdiction, Russian artillery firing harassment missions from positions far enough back that the Chonhar bridge itself was outside the direct impact zone. The calculations here were precise. Russian artillery could reach the Ukrainian blocking position, but shelling it risked shrapnel and overpressure effects on the bridge deck, and, more importantly, risked triggering the demolition charges if a near miss struck close enough to a command detonation line. Russian artillery fired 37 harassment missions over the 11 days. Ukrainian Marines took 2 wounded, none killed. The strangest detail I keep returning to in this operation isn't the drone strikes or the blocking position. It's the sound reports from Ukrainian Marines describing those 11 days. Isolated on a 400-meter causeway segment, with Russian positions on both ends of the axis, the Marines described long stretches of near-complete silence between probe attempts, the wind off the strait, occasional artillery at distance, and the routine of a defensive position doing exactly what it was designed to do, existing, holding, costing the other side more than it cost Ukraine to sustain. Russian Logistics Command spent those 11 days attempting to quantify the damage. The arithmetic was brutal. The Chonhar crossing normally moved between 45 and 60 supply convoys per day. At 45 convoys rerouted to the Kerch ferry crossing, with each ferry round trip taking approximately 4 hours and the ferry capacity handling 18 trucks per crossing, the peninsula resupply rate dropped by approximately 62% for ammunition and fuel during the standoff. Artillery units in Crimean garrison positions reported supply levels dropping to below 70% of operational threshold by day 7. 2 planned offensive operations in the northern Crimea area were postponed due to ammunition supply constraints. The negotiated tactical withdrawal came on June 25, 2026, after 11 days and 3 hours on the position. Ukrainian Command and Russian Logistics Command, through intermediaries, reached an understanding. The Marines would withdraw without detonating the demolition charges, and Russia would allow the withdrawal without engagement. Neither side announced it as a deal. Ukraine announced a planned tactical redeployment. Russia announced that security forces had restored access to the crossing. The Chonhar vehicle lane reopened to traffic on June 26. The bridge was intact. The charges came out with the Marines. But the 11-day window had already done its work. If you believe tactics win wars, type Steelfront in the comments. Because what happened at Chonhar is exactly the kind of precision operational thinking that decides campaigns before the history books catch up. The damage assessment, as compiled by Ukrainian General Staff and verified through commercial satellite imagery analysis by multiple open-source intelligence organizations, ran as follows. 2 Pantsir S-1 air defense systems destroyed. Replacement value approximately $30 million. 1 communications and observation tower destroyed. The Russian motor rifle company at the approach position sustained casualties in the initial securing action and subsequent probe operations. Ukrainian sources estimate between 40 and 60 personnel casualties across the 11-day period, including the Armyansk QRF's probe actions. 3 Russian vehicles were confirmed destroyed by the June 16 HIMARS strike on the staging area. But the operational numbers that mattered were the logistics figures. Ukrainian intelligence assessed that 214 planned resupply shipments were moved off their original Chonhar routing schedules during the 11 days. Of those, approximately 142 were successfully rerouted through Kerch at degraded throughput. 72 shipments, primarily heavy ammunition lots and fuel tanker convoys, were delayed beyond their operational delivery windows. 2 planned Russian artillery fire missions in northern Crimea, scheduled for June 17 and June 21, were cancelled due to ammunition supply constraints directly traceable to the Chonhar interdiction. What would NATO doctrine have done differently at Chonhar? It's a genuinely interesting question, and the answers in our comments section have been more sophisticated than most of what you see in professional defense analysis. Drop your analysis below. The best responses get featured in our follow-up breakdown. The lessons from Chonhar are not subtle. First, ground interdiction of a logistics node can achieve effects that long-range fires cannot, because it creates a decision dilemma for the defender that destruction does not. A destroyed bridge is a problem to be solved. A seized bridge with demolition charges is a weapon aimed at the defender's most sensitive operational nerve. Second, drone suppression as the enabling layer for ground maneuver is no longer theoretical. The 35th Marine Brigade demonstrated at Chonhar what Ukrainian doctrine has been building towards since 2023, a combined arms architecture where drone operators clear the path and infantry executes the seizure. The 40-minute suppression window was not luck. It was the product of 4 months of calibration operations, specifically designed to answer the timing questions before the real mission launched. Third, operational surprise is achievable even against a forewarned enemy, if the method is sufficiently unexpected. Russia expected long-range strikes against Chonhar. Russia had hardened the bridge against long-range strikes. Nobody in the Russian defensive architecture had seriously war-gamed a 52-man marine assault across an open causeway because the calculus suggested it was suicidal. The calculus was wrong because it did not account for what happens when the Pantsir systems are gone, and the observation tower is gone, and the QRF has no warning time. Now for the answer to the vehicle count question from earlier in this breakdown. The correct answer is B. 38 vehicles were disabled, destroyed, or taken out of the operational rotation during the 11-day Chonhar standoff and the operations immediately preceding it. 2 Pantsir S-1 vehicles destroyed by FPV strikes during the suppression phase. 3 vehicles confirmed by satellite imagery in the June 16 HIMARS staging area strike. 33 Russian logistics vehicles that were part of convoys turned back from the Chonhar approach during the standoff, subsequently tracked by Ukrainian intelligence as they rerouted through Kerch, where 3 suffered mechanical failures and 1 collided with another vehicle on the ferry approach road in the congestion caused by the rerouting surge. The number is less about direct destruction and more about the cascading operational disruption that a 2-day tactical seizure by 52 Marines imposed on a major Russian logistics corridor for 11 days. That is the metric that makes Chonhar significant. 3 questions this operation leaves unresolved. Was the decision to withdraw without demolishing the charges the right call? Ukraine gained 11 days of interdiction, but left the bridge intact for Russian use. A demolition would have extended the logistics disruption by weeks. The counter-argument is that a demolished bridge closes the option for future seizure operations and potentially accelerates Russian investment in alternative resupply routes that would ultimately prove more resilient. Where you land on this depends on how you weight near-term attrition against long-term positional advantage. It is not obvious. It was not obvious to the Ukrainian commanders making the call. Could Russia have prevented this? Almost certainly yes, but the prevention would have required doctrinal changes that Russian military command has consistently been unwilling to make, distributing the observation function across multiple redundant points rather than a single tower, giving the Army's QRF authority to move without waiting for a communications relay from a garrison command structure that took 17 minutes to receive a cell phone call, integrating drone suppression into the defensive perimeter rather than relying exclusively on large platform air defense systems that have proven repeatedly vulnerable to multi-axis FPV approach. These are not exotic requirements. They are adaptations that Ukrainian forces made in 2023. Russia in 2026 is still learning them the expensive way. What would you have done differently? Specifically, if you were the Ukrainian brigade commander planning Chonhar, would you have detonated the charges on the way out, trading the future seizure option for immediate maximum damage? Comment with your answer and your reasoning. The operational trade-offs here are exactly what military schools will be dissecting for years. Real tactics, real consequences. Steel Front. Subscribe to Steel Front. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Not the simplified version, not the political version. The operational mechanics, the timing windows, the decision points, and the lessons that actually transfer to understanding how modern warfare works. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. Chonhar was proof of that. A 52-man marine element, a 40-minute drone suppression window, 4 months of calibration intelligence, and the operational insight to understand that the most powerful weapon in the Chonhar engagement was not the demolition charges, it was the possibility that they might be used. The bridge is open now. The Pantsir craters are still there, visible in commercial satellite imagery, along the approach road north of the causeway, silent reminders that in the summer of 2026, 52 Marines held a 600-meter position against a garrison of hundreds for 11 days, and the most powerful army Russia could put on the northern Crimea approach could not move them without paying a price it was not willing to pay. The Chonhar causeway is quiet now, but the demolition survey marks are still scratched into the vehicle lane concrete where the charges were placed. A 400-meter segment of road that became, for 11 days, the most strategically significant piece of ground in southern Ukraine. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Steel Front.